Good morning. I wanted to make a short, quick video to talk to you guys to remind you about positives and negatives and all the positive and negative rules that you've got to know before we can do those very long algebra problems and combine your like terms. Remember that when you're doing distributive property and multiplying the number on the outside of the parentheses by all the numbers on the inside of the parentheses, you've got to know your negative and positive rules before we can add in variables or anything else. So let's start with some very simple, easy positive and negative rules, and then we'll move on to our distributive property and combining like terms, okay? So our first rule that we learned that you should have written in your composition notebook is when you are combining a negative and a positive number. Combining just means putting those together. So if there's a subtraction sign in front of a number, that subtraction sign makes that number behind it a negative, and you should know that. So let's start with a positive and negative first. Anytime you've got one positive number and one negative number, you start by finding the difference. Difference means to subtract between those two numbers. So let's look at a couple of examples. All right, on the first one here in green, we have negative 12 plus positive 5. We now have one negative and one positive. The rule when you have one negative and one positive is to find the difference. What is the difference between 12 and 5? 12 minus 5 is 7. So that is 7. You know that whenever you find the difference, the sign of your answer will be the same sign as the larger number. Which is larger, 12 or 5? It's 12. And since 12 is a negative, our answer is going to be a negative 7. So anytime you've got one negative, one positive, find the difference, and your answer will be the same sign as the larger number. Now look down here. We've got a 10 plus a negative 15. We've got one positive and one negative. Anytime you have one positive and one negative, you find the difference. What is the difference between 10 and 15? 15 minus 10 is 5. There's a 5 difference there. Now, is it going to be a positive or a negative? It's going to be a negative because 15 is a larger number and it is a negative. So our answer here is negative 5. All right, so that's the main rule. Another rule that you need to learn is whenever you're combining two negatives. Anytime you're adding two negatives, think about two debts or two charges coming out of a bank account. So if you're already negative 10 in the bank, that's what you got right now. Only no dollars, you got negative $10. And you add another charge for negative $5. You've got negative 10 plus another negative. When you add two negatives, anytime you add two negatives, it's just going to be more negative. So a negative plus more negative will always just be more negative. That's your addition rules. Let's look at a couple of subtraction problems. All right. Anytime you've got a subtraction sign in front of a number like this, 10 minus 12. This is 10 minus 12. That subtraction sign in front of the 12 means that 12 is negative. Because if you've got $10 in the bank, can you take 12 away? Not unless you go negative. So this subtraction sign or any subtraction sign in front of a number means that's a negative number. So 10 minus 12 is the same as saying 10 plus negative 12. And that is going to give us a negative 2. It's a bad negative right there. That's going to be a negative 2. Because when you got one negative, one positive, the answer is going to be the sign of the larger number. So 10 minus 12 is going to be negative 2. If you had $10 in the bank and you try to take away 12, you're in the hole. You've got negative 2. Now your last rule whenever you're subtracting is that when you have a subtraction sign and a negative right beside each other, like this. We've got 10 minus negative 5. 10 minus a negative 5. See how these two signs are right beside each other, almost touching. There's a subtraction and a negative side by side. The rule when you have a subtraction sign and a negative side by side like that is that they cancel each other out. So instead of 10 minus negative 5, these both become positives. And that is 10 plus 5, which is a positive 15. That is simply a rule that you have to remember. Subtraction sign and a negative side by side like that becomes everything is positive, and you're going to add, you've got a positive 15. That's rules just to remember. You've got to remember these rules for combining like terms. Now, the only two rules to remember for negatives and positives are a negative times a positive will always give you a negative answer, and a negative times a negative will always give you a positive answer. If you want to pause and write this down, if you don't have it already written down somewhere, or if you just need to remember, a negative times a positive. Anytime there's one negative and one positive and you're multiplying or dividing, actually, it will be a negative answer. Anytime you multiply a negative times a negative or divide, the rules are the same for division, a negative divided by a negative will always give you a positive answer. These are rules that you just got to remember and practice over and over again until you get it like second nature. Now, I want to show you real quick why you need to know all of these rules. The reason is because you're in 7th grade math now, and it gets harder. So let's look at a simple problem combining like terms. We've got a variable here, and we are going to solve this problem, all right? We always start with our distributive property. Distributive property is multiplication. It's where you distribute this to or multiply it by everything on the inside of this parentheses. So we start by multiplying negative 2 times positive 3x. Well, if you listened and you know that a negative times a positive gives you a negative, you'll know that negative 2 times positive 3 is negative 6, and that's x. Negative 2 times positive 3 is negative 6x. Now you multiply the negative 2 times the negative 4, because whatever's on the outside, you don't just multiply by one thing on the inside of the parentheses. You multiply by everything inside the parentheses. So we've got negative 2 times negative 4. A negative times a negative will give you what? A positive. So a negative times a negative is a positive, put a plus sign, 8. Right? So we did our distributive property. The plus 5x is not being multiplied. It's just part of the expression. So you bring that down now. Combining like terms is a 6th grade standard that you learned last year, and that just means that you can only add if they have the same variable. So a negative 6x and a 5x can be added because they both have an x. We can't add the 8 because it doesn't have a variable, and those are unlike terms. So the only thing we can do here is say, all right, let's combine negative 6x plus 5x. Well, if you know that negative 6 plus 5 is 1 negative, 1 positive, that means you find the difference, and your sign is the sign of the larger number. Negative 6 plus 5 is a negative 1, and that is negative 1x. And then just bring down your plus 8, and you can't combine anything else because those are unlike terms. This equation right here is why you have to know your negative and positive rules for 7th grade math. Now, when we start adding in fractions and decimals, you don't have to stress out about it as much because you're going to be given a calculator. And so as long as you know your negative and positive rules, you would have known that, say, negative 1/2 times this would have given you a negative number, and negative times a negative would have given you a positive number, and you've got that calculator to help fill in the answers, all right? And then you know your rules for combining like terms. All right, this is just one quick video to help you get prepared for the end of the year testing or the diagnostic that's coming up, and I hope you've learned something. If you have any questions, then just email me or let me know. Bye.